We're talking about listening to understand, but understand what? What are we trying to understand? There's three main things. One, we're trying to understand how the other person is perceiving the world. So like in this comic where it's the two guys looking at the optical illusion from different sides, in that case, we're really just genuinely trying to understand, how do you see the world? What do you see going on here? At a slightly deeper level is, how do they feel about the way they see the world? So we see the world differently, and because we see the world differently, we have different emotional reactions to that. So we can be looking at the same thing, we can be seeing it from different perspectives, and we can be having different emotional reactions to that. So you want to understand, how are people seeing the world and what are they feeling about it? One way we often try to give empathy is to share, if someone's sharing something difficult with us, we'll often share a similar experience that we had. So maybe someone will say, oh man, my dog just died. And we'll say, oh, I remember when my dog died in high school and what a powerful thing it was. And we're trying to use a shared experience to connect to the other person, to build this empathy and give them that shared connection. That can be a useful tool, it can be a powerful tool, but you have to be really careful of not pivoting the conversation back to yourself. That it's not, oh, your dog died? Well, listen to the story about when my dog died, and you're pivoting the conversation back to yourself. If you use that, use it as a tool to connect to the other person and to share their experience, not to bring the conversation back to your own experience. And you know that you're really good at empathy. Again, this is just like listening to understand. You know you're really good at empathy when someone comes up to you and says, you're a jerk, and you're like, oh man, that sounds really hard for you. I'm sorry. I'm sorry that you have this experience of me being a jerk. And you know, when you can do that, you know that you're really good at providing empathy to people. The other thing that people need from you, or the other reason that people talk to you often, is because they need advice. They don't know how to do something, and so they're looking for your help with it. My sister's a tax accountant, and she helps me with my taxes sometimes. I call her up and I'm like, hey, I don't know how to fill out this form. I don't need her to say, oh, that sounds really hard for you. Tell me about your difficulty filling out the form. Like, I'm not looking for empathy. I'm looking for advice, for structure. That is the rare exception. Most of the time, people are not looking for advice, and never give advice to someone unless they explicitly ask you for it. In How to Win Friends and Influence People, Dale Carnegie gives this great metaphor, which is, imagine that your friend comes to you and they say, man, I'm having trouble seeing, like my vision's getting a little blurry. And you go, oh, I used to have that exact same problem. And then my doctor gave me these glasses, and now the problem's totally fixed. Here, put my glasses on. Is that going to solve the other person's vision problem? No, of course not, because those glasses are for you. They work for you. They solve your problem, but they don't work for the other person. And that story sounds so stupid and so ridiculous that you're like, who would ever try that? You would never do it, right? And yet we do this all the time. When people come to us with problems, we tell them about what worked for us, and we insist they do what worked for us. But that's not, it may not work for them. That's not the purpose. The purpose is to understand and try to help them figure out what will work for them, not to give a lecture on what worked for you. When you give someone advice, essentially what you're telling them is like, your problems aren't that big a deal. Like, just do this thing and your problem will go away. And so it's really dismissive when people are really worried about something or really sad about something, and you're like, why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? It doesn't drive connection, even if it's coming from a place of like trying to help them. It doesn't drive connection or make them feel better. Instead, it sounds like you're saying to them, your problems aren't that big a deal. Why don't you just go out and fix them? And so it feels dismissive. When you feel compelled to give advice, try giving empathy instead. And I promise you, you're going to be listening to someone over the next week, over the course of your life, and they're saying something, and you're like, oh man, I know exactly what you should do. I know exactly what you should do. And it's going to be in your head, and you're going to want to like interrupt them and say it. And the next time when you feel that compulsion, that need to jump in and give advice, Instead, consciously say something like, oh man, that sounds really hard for you. Or, oh, that sounds so exciting. And instead of trying to tell them what to do, try to connect to them about their own experience and see how that goes, because I am confident that it almost always leads to a better outcome. The last reason that people talk to you is because they want you to change your behavior, that you're doing something that bothers them, or you're doing something that they really like, and they want you to increase one behavior or get rid of another behavior. And so often we talk to people, and the thing that we want from them is to change. We're going to talk a lot about feedback, so I won't dwell on it too much here, but just keep in mind when someone comes to you and they're giving you feedback, they're wanting you to change your behavior, try to understand where they're coming from. That's the initial thing you should do, is try to understand the source of the feedback and how they see the world.